Yeah, thank you. So this evening, what we're going to be looking at is actually spiritual manifestations of gifts. I'm going to put it in that way. Supernatural gifts. I say that because when people come to study the Bible and you meet people who say, oh yeah, I'm very serious about the Bible, sometimes it's almost like they think it's just like a highly advanced piece of literature, like a really good book or a really good piece of poetry, and they seem to forget the fact that it is actually a spiritual book, and that God is a spirit, and so we shouldn't be surprised when we encounter, particularly even to do with the church, supernatural things, spiritual things, and that's really what we're going to be looking at tonight. What the Apostle Paul has been doing is, over the course of the last few chapters, chapter 12 and chapter 13, is really and kind of sort of masterfully preparing us for this chapter, what we're calling this passage tonight, chapter 14, verses 1 to 12. So he's been laying the sort of groundwork as to how to accept and how to understand spiritual gifts. And importantly, because of the Corinthian church and because of some of the problems and the issues that they were having, it's really necessary for him to do this and to put it in its proper place. So just keep your finger in chapter 14 there, and just turn back, if you would, to chapter 12. And we'll take just verse 1 of chapter 12. He says, "Now concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I would not have you ignorant." And then he goes on in verse 7 to talk about these spiritual gifts, and then uses that word that I used, but the manifestation of the Spirit is given to every man to profit withal. For to one is given by the Spirit the word of wisdom, to another the word of knowledge by the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another the gifts of healing by the same Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another discerning of spirits, to another diverse kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. But all these worketh that one and the selfsame Spirit, dividing to every man severally as he will. So the two gifts we're looking at tonight are the gift of tongues, or speaking in tongues, and the gift of prophecy. But the reason I want to read that to you in chapter 12 is that Paul makes it clear in chapter 12 that first of all they have their origin with the Holy Spirit. It's the same Spirit, it's not a different Spirit giving different types of gifts. Secondly, tongues deserves no more emphasis than gifts of teaching or healing or believing or preaching. All of these gifts are, when done properly, the work of the Holy Spirit. Next, what I want you to consider is that the two sessions of teaching we had when Norman came on chapter 13, and to properly understand that the gifts, whatever they are, must be seen in the light of the statement made in 1 Corinthians 13, if I have not charity, that is, if I have not agape love, I am nothing. So that's the proper sort of groundwork that Paul's been laying. Is it's been explaining where tongues and prophecy fit into all the other gifts. He's also been explaining that it's one Spirit behind all those gifts, and he's also been explaining that without love, these things are really of no value as far as God is concerned. So this gives a clearer understanding of the correct position of the gifts of tongues and of prophecy. Just turn to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew 7. And We'll look at verse 22. And of course it's Jesus speaking, and he says, "Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity." So the fact that somebody is exercising a spiritual gift, the fact that God is, if you like, speaking through a person, is not a guarantee that the person has God's approval. As you see there in Matthew 7, it is not a guarantee even that the person is a Christian, because in John 11 we have Caiaphas, the high priest, prophesying sort of unbeknown to himself, yet God is using him. And also in Numbers it talks about Balaam's donkey or ass speaking, and he's speaking the truth. God, if you like, is speaking through him. But none of these things guarantee that we have either God's approval or that even that the person has God's spirit. What is important, once again, as Paul states in Galatians 5 verse 6, faith which worketh by love. So again, love is the context, that agape love for God, and then that love for our brothers and sisters. That is the thing to be valued, and those gifts must be seen as being part or having their base and their root in love. Then they can edify, then they can do their work in the church. So what about the gift of tongues? What are they, and are they for today? Just a quick hand show here. Anybody actually speak in tongues? Shy? No? Oh, okay. Right, well they are quite, in certain streams of Christianity, certain denominations, speaking in tongues is, if we were in one of those denominations, probably every hand would have gone up, or most hands would have gone up. So it's very, I don't want to use the word popular, but widespread amongst certain denominations. Now whether that genuinely is speaking in tongues is another matter. But we'll look at that as we go through. Some people say, "Oh no, it's finished now." They're called cessationists. They say the gifts are finished. They were all right for a time, but now God doesn't use them anymore. In fact, some would go even further than that and say, look, if someone is speaking in tongues, that it's actually of the devil, it's demonic, and God would not approve of that. And one of the reasons they give is they say, well, in pagan cultures there are people who speak in unknown languages, and that is absolutely true. I was reading today about in ancient Greece, we're studying ancient Greece with the children, and I was reading about ancient Greece saying that there was a shrine, I think it was to Apollo or someone like that, and the priestess there would speak. It was what we call an oracle, and she would say, this is what the gods say. And sometimes she would speak in rhyme, sometimes she would speak maybe a riddle, and at other times she would speak in this sort of ecstatic, sort of gobbledygook, I guess you'd say. And then somebody would interpret and say, oh yeah, this is what she's saying. So people say, well, aha, there you are, you see. It's of a pagan origin. To me, that is a very weak argument, because if you look at pagan cultures, you look at any sort of idolatrous religion, yes, they may speak in other tongues, but they also pray. They also perform acts of supernatural healing. So there are many other aspects that are in Christianity that you find in pagan religion. So to just say, oh well, it's in paganism, same as the argument with the Trinity. Oh, there are trinities in paganism. Yes, there are, but that does not undervalue. It doesn't mean that the concept, the doctrine of the Trinity is false. It just means that there are counterfeits of it throughout paganism and throughout other false religions. So to me, that's not much of an argument. The first time that we encounter tongues is in Acts 2 verse 4, where at Pentecost it says they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak with other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Some have said, well, there you go, it was used for the spreading of the gospel to all those different nations. There were people gathered in Jerusalem, and they were hearing the speaking of the wonderful works of God in their own languages. Therefore, it was a way of just, if you like, really kick-starting the gospel. They took that little message home, and off they went to Rome and Asia and all these different places, and they took that bit of the gospel with them. And I think there is some, grounds for that, particularly if you look in the first couple of chapters of Romans. How did the gospel get there ahead of Peter, ahead of Paul, and people like that? So I think there is some validity in that. But as we look through 1 Corinthians 14, Paul seems to be concerning himself when he talks about tongues, not with speaking to other men, but actually with speaking to God. That seems to be the emphasis. So we'll have a look at 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 2. And I'll just read that out to you. It says, I'm going to sort of dip in and out some of these verses, not going to read them all in order, but hopefully you'll get a good picture of it. So verse 2 of 1 Corinthians 14, For he that speaketh in an unknown tongue speaketh not unto man, but unto God. For no man understandeth him, howbeit in the Spirit he speaketh mysteries. So no man understands him, but he's speaking to God. And he's speaking mysteries to God. We also read in verse 4 that he that speaketh in an unknown tongue edifieth himself. In other words, he builds himself up. So straight away we can see a number of properties about what speaking in tongues is. It is speaking to God, first of all. It is speaking in mysteries. In other words, the person who's speaking it doesn't, at least initially, understand what he's saying. He's praying without his understanding, but he's somehow caught along with the Spirit of God, and he's praying, and he's edifying himself. There's a sense in which he's building himself up in his spirit. So there is some supernatural way in which he is being encouraged, emboldened, strengthened, and yet the church isn't. The church isn't being those things. Why? Simply because others cannot understand what's being said. Nobody else can understand what he's saying. So Paul says, if you've got this gift, which is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and you're speaking in tongues, you might be edified, you might be having this connection with God, and you're speaking directly to him, and it may be having a supernatural effect on you, but it's not on the people around you. In verse 7, Paul draws a parallel, or he gives an analogy, and he says it's a bit like those things that are without life that give sound, whether pipe or harp, except they give a distinction in the sounds, how shall it be known what is piped or harped? Now I think the context of that is, if you imagine in a congregation, and I was just kind of thinking about it, just sort of relating it to our own church. If Roger, who is very masterful on the piano, of course, sat up one morning and just started playing just a whole load of random notes, just a big kind of cacophony of sound, that we would just be stood there completely bewildered. We wouldn't know, well, what's he playing? What's the hymn? What are we supposed to sing? Are we, is it slow? Is it fast? Or we would just be there bewildered. And it's the same, I think, with speaking in tongues. What Paul is saying is, how will we know what truth is being transmitted? How will we know what knowledge is being imparted unless we have understanding of it? Now it says, verse 10, there are, it may be, so many kinds of voices in the world, and none of them is without significance. So when it comes to other languages, if you are fluent in that language, then whilst to others it might sound like gobbledygook, it might sound like meaningless, if you are fluent in that language, then you're able to communicate. You're able to understand what the other person is saying. And I kind of liken this, if you've been in this position where you're going to a takeaway or something like that, and you know, you stand there. Of course, you're all eat very healthily and probably never go to takeaways anymore. But if you stand there, you take a breath. If you stand there at the counter and you say to the person, "Yeah, I'd like rice and whatever it is," and they say, "Yeah, no problem," and then they turn to their colleague and sort of say something in a foreign language, and then they suddenly start having this conversation. I don't know if you've ever been in that position. You just stand there smiling, thinking, "I've no idea what they're talking about. Yeah, are they talking about me?" And yet they're communicating quite easily with one another, because verse 11 says, "Therefore, if I know not the meaning of the voice, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me." In other words, like somebody from a completely another country that have no idea what they're talking about. So therefore, if someone is coming and saying, "Oh, I've got this wonderful gift, so I've got this gift of tongues, and I want to share it with everybody," and they start to release and to operate this gift, Paul's saying, of what use is it to anybody unless you understand what is being said? So why is Paul telling us all this? He's about to compare it with another gift, which is the gift of prophecy. So he's not saying that it's wrong to speak in tongues. Let me just say that first of all. He's not saying, "Oh, you shouldn't be speaking in tongues." He's saying, look, if you're speaking in tongues in private by yourself, and it's you and God communicating, and if you have that gift, right, if God has imparted that gift to you, then it's not wrong for you to use that. In fact, it will edify you, it will build you up. But if you are using it in the context of the congregation, as we'll see as it goes on later on in these passages, we'll see that there are rules for using it, rules that it's important that it is then interpreted if you're going to use it in a congregation. Now, some people will still say, well, you know, I don't believe that it's for today. I believe it's, you know, was okay then and it's sort of passed away now. I find it hard to see any verses that would indicate that. Sometimes 1 Corinthians 13 is used, verse 8, charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies they shall fail, whether there be tongues they shall cease. And they say, well, there you are, they shall cease. But I think it goes on to say, whether there is knowledge, it shall vanish away. Now we know that knowledge hasn't vanished away, it hasn't gone. We're still growing in knowledge. People are still imparting knowledge through their teaching, and so I don't see that it has ceased. I think a lot of what passes for tongues is not tongues, to put it that way. I think it can be a kind of learned behaviour, which is tragic, really, because this is what human beings are like. They see something that is counterfeit or of the flesh, and then they reject it all. Whereas 1 Thessalonians 5:21 talks about not despising prophecy, not despising these spiritual things, rather proving all things, testing them, and holding on to that which is good. And so I think that's a healthy mindset for a church to have. Look, we will not rule these things out, but we will test them, we will prove them, and see if they truly are of God. If they are, we'll hold on to them, and if they're not, then we must say that's of the flesh, it's not of the Lord. Okay, so I want to move on to prophecy now. Greek word that is used is prophetuo, and we think of prophecy, you think, oh yeah, the Old Testament prophets, they said what was going to happen. This is going to happen and that's going to happen. Well, it's quite a broad term. I was sort of studying it, looking at it. It does not necessarily mean foretelling the future. It can simply mean to speak under divine inspiration. So it's the Holy Spirit speaking something through the person, and it doesn't bypass the person's intellect or whatever. I think it's not like going into a trance and sort of just this thing speaking through you. It involves the person's own mind, but it is God speaking through. And maybe you've even experienced that to a sort of greater or lesser degree, where you're in a conversation with a person and something comes into your mind and you start to talk, and you have the person's attention, maybe you're sharing the gospel or something like that, and you come away thinking, wow, that wasn't me, that was the Lord. That's the sort of, I feel that's really, when it's talking about prophecy here, it is that special moving of the Holy Spirit where God speaks through you to the benefit of others, and yet it doesn't bypass your own mind. Your mind is involved in it, but you just say, hey, this is from the Lord. I know it is. All right. So for further guidance of what that would be like, just have a look there at verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 14. It says, but he that prophesieth speaketh unto men to edification and exhortation and comfort. So it's those three things: edification, building up, exhortation and comfort. So I feel that should be what is characterising the gift of prophecy. Prophesying is, it should be building up the church, it should be exhorting people, it should be bringing comfort to people. For those reasons, I think that because it isn't sort of teaching as such, I think it's entirely legitimate that it is a gift that can be used by men or women, since it doesn't come into that category of teaching or questioning. In 1 Corinthians 11 verse 5 we read about women that prayeth and prophesieth. Right? Just turn to Acts chapter 2 a second. Acts 2. And we'll look at verse 17. And it shall come to pass in the last days, saith God, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. And on my servants and on my handmaidens I will pour out in those days of my spirit, and they shall prophesy. They shall prophesy. So the term that's used there is the last days, the sort of what I would call the gospel dispensation of grace. The church is in there, that both men and women. And again, sort of further to that, you have to look it up, but Acts 21 verse 9, we read about Philip the evangelist, who had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. That tells you that it was happening at that time. It wasn't some future, a date that we're to look forward to. It was actually happening there with the early church. So these are gifts which are for the building up, for the edifying of the church, whether it's speaking in tongues or whether it's prophecy. I don't see an indication that they've now finished, but if they're to be exercised, and I think it is beneficial that they are exercised, but otherwise, how's the church going to be built up and edified? They should be used, as we'll go on to see as we go through 1 Corinthians 14, there are special rules regarding the exercising of those gifts. But at this stage, because we're not through the rest of 1 Corinthians 14 yet, at this stage what I would say is seek those gifts, but as Paul says, rather seek the greater gift, or the better gift, really is what it is. Prophesying, why is it a better gift? Because it will edify the whole church, not just you. Whereas tongues, simply edifying the person who has the gift. So seek the gifts, but understand that they are just one of many different gifts. Just because it seems to be more supernatural, it's a language that hasn't been learned, it is no less the same spirit behind it as is behind teaching, preaching, healing, and all the other gifts that come from the Holy Spirit. So we mustn't think that it's something, wow, tongues, yeah. No, it's not. It's, as I said at the very beginning, the Bible is a spiritual book. God is a spirit. Gott ist ein Geist. I like to say to the children in our German, that is what God is. Therefore, is it a surprise that he produces things that are spiritual in people? No. The church is not a committee, a social group that meets together to study a fantastic piece of literature. It is Christ's body on earth, and we need to remind ourselves of that. So just really I'm going to just sum up what I've said, I guess. Firstly, the gift of tongues edifies the individual, but not the church. And that's fine, okay? But in personal devotions, you don't need an interpreter. But if you are using that gift in the context of a congregation, you should either have an interpreter, or know that somebody's there who can interpret, or you should be prepared to interpret it yourself. Otherwise, don't exercise the gift. Secondly, the gift of prophecy edifies both the individual, since of course it's from God, so it's going to be edifying, but it also edifies the congregation. And we should be looking at not teaching as such, although it could be dependent on who's giving it, but it is largely exhortational. It is comforting and edifying. Okay, so both those gifts are available to men and women. Both may be given when the church is assembled. Finally, again, just to reiterate, all the gifts are from the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 4. All the gifts are for the edifying of the church. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 12. All the gifts are worthless as far as God is concerned, unless they are subservient to charity, which is that agape love. Yeah?